On Production is brought to you by Wrapbook, the production industry's only on-demand payroll platform. With Wrapbook, you can pay your crew with a click and track all your costs in real time, all in one place. To find out more about how Wrapbook is transforming the way productions pay their crews, visit wrapbook.com.
Hello and welcome to a special Halloween episode of On Production brought to you by Wrapbook. Today, I'm thrilled to host Stephen Follows, a film industry data researcher. Stephen's latest project is detailed on horrormoviereport.com, and it offers really fresh insights into the horror genre that are invaluable for filmmakers. Join me as we dive into his latest findings and discover the trends that define today's horror cinema. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I mean, let's jump right in. Can you start by telling us about the current surge in horror film production? What do you think is driving this unprecedented boom?
You're absolutely right. It's crazy how many films, because we all know that more films are being made over the last couple of decades of all genres because it's easier to shoot a film. There's more distribution methods. Also, information is much more available as well. So there's already a trend of movies exploding in production. But horror is also gaining market share. So in this already exploding market, so let's say 20 years ago, about 5%, 6% of films were horror films. Now it's about 12%. So in this already growing market, there's already an increase in horror. So we're seeing over 1,500 horror movies made every year, which is, I mean, you couldn't watch them. I mean, you wouldn't want to watch a lot of them, I can imagine, but it is fascinating. And I think it's a few things. I think, certainly that it's easier to make a film than ever before. You can make a 4K film on the smartphone. And I went to film school in around 2000. I remember the pain of buying and processing film just to get anything on the screen. And then there's more ways of distributing stuff. There's more information about what films are. You don't really need to pay for film school. Film school achieves certain things, but it's more to do with the human interactions and social networking, things like that, rather than locked away information. But also within horror itself, there is a certain, well, first of all, it already supports low budget. It is the genre that is most made on low budget. So if we see a boom in low budget films, which is what we're seeing, then we're going to see a boom in horror. But also, I think there's an acceptance. Like, if you think about the 1980s, like, video nasties, like VHS copies with these like illicit films almost, and like it just felt sort of shame. But those people who loved those films have grown up and created more films, and as those people now run studios, and this shame has sort of morphed into pride, where people are like, "Yeah, I love horror. Horror's great fun," and it entertains the audience and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a number of factors at play, I guess.
I'm really also curious, so I was able to see a bit of a preview of your report, and one of the statements I believe it makes is that the American film industry is dominating horror production. How do you see this influencing global film markets?
Well, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. Horror is about 3/4 of all horror movies ever made. But that is shifting slowly, but it is shifting. So, for example, we've seen a lot more horror out of South Asia as well. So Indonesia has gone from almost having no horror films 20 years ago to now maybe 1/4 of their films are horror films. So I think it's fantastic because you get to see completely different types of horror. If you look at The Ring, the Japanese version from towards the end of the last century, and then you look at the American remake, it's a good remake, but it's also got to make changes based on what we think of this as the supernatural, what we respect, what we fear. And a lot of horror films are showing a lot about people's culture. I mean, look at Get Out, things like that, or Us, or whatever. These are films are by design reflecting the society. So when you get films from different countries and different places, not only do you get the joy of a film that's great, but you also learn about another way of living in the world, another culture. Like, it's really, you get thrown headfirst into it, and it's really exciting.
That's so interesting, Stephen. So I actually have an interesting question on the inverse of that. So if what you're saying is true, that we can sort of see cultural mirrors as to what brings people horror, have you seen any correlation in differences in what brings different film cultures joy? It's not exactly, it's a little bit off of the mark of us talking exclusively about horror, but I'm curious if the inverse is true, related to unique joys of certain cultures in their film craft.
That's such a great question. I love it. What I would say is that in the past, I had a question. All my best questions come from my readers or from someone I chat to at a film festival or whatever. And someone said to me, do films with happy endings make more money than films with sad endings? And I really thought about it and I tried to study it. And there's functional problems there because what is a happy ending? At the end of Gladiator, both the villain and the hero die, but he's also in heaven, but with the wife and children that burn to death. I don't know if that's a happy ending. But also, then I thought, I'm going to study sci-fi utopia versus dystopia. I thought, okay, well, that's a narrower field. But then with every film, things go wrong. Demolition Man happens in a utopia. And arguably, the utopia is pretty good, actually. We laugh at it for being naive, perhaps, but it seems pretty happy, clean and safe, as long as you're the people above ground, obviously, as with any film. So that becomes hard. But one thing I was able to measure a while back, I don't have the data with me in front of me, so forgive me if I get the numbers wrong, but I remember the message, and also we can link to it in the show notes. I did look at whether films with positive messages are more successful than those without positive messages. And so you might ask, well, how do you even know that? And it's because there are lots of parental groups that rate movies based on how much sex, drugs, violence. And some of them also measure things like capitalism, positive messages as well, which is separate to religion. They're often highly connected, but fundamentally there are measures out there of what people who are professional reviewers think of the positivity of a movie. So we're able to take them en masse and correlate them with things like box office and, crucially, profitability, an estimate of profitability. And yes, we found that actually films with positive messages do tend to make more money or be more profitable, as I suppose we're saying it, than films without positive messages. Now, it might just be that there's an undersupply, and so therefore the ones that get through. But I feel that. I mean, I think that the more recent Blade Runner film is absolute work of genius when it comes to art. But as a piece of entertainment that I want to watch, I mean, there's enough misery in the world as there is. I mean, I get enough of that at home. I don't need to pay someone else to make it all. And so my personal, as a film fan, belief is that positive messages is where you want to go if you're making cold, calculated decisions as a studio head. And I think the data backs it up, although there's obviously nuance within all of it. We can't say categorically that is the only answer. But I think the world you'd make more money if you over-indexed on positive messages, I think.
That's so fascinating. And then, but, sort of the classic themes or stories that we hear on the ground in the film production business is like, wow, let's go do a low budget, high production quality horror film and get 1,000x return. Like you do hear about that story, I think, anecdotally more often in the horror genre than on the sort of happy-go-lucky endings of films.
Yeah, and there's a few reasons. I mean, there is also the adage that if you put a puppy in a family movie, you'll make money. And that Freaky Friday as a template has done so well so often that if you are cynically making films, there are lots of positive templates you can take. It's just that they're less... Somehow filmmakers are less keen to talk about them. People wouldn't go, I made a puppy film, whereas they go, I made a horror film. So I think that's a cultural understanding of why people get into film, and also the types of people. Tend to be younger people who are more excited about running around with guns in Tarantino films and horror films with knives than they are about puppies and the goodness of the family unit. So I think that's a cultural thing about what we talk about more than anything else.
It's so interesting. Okay, well, going back a little bit, in your research, you noted a high proportion of horror films sort of emergent in Southeast Asian cinema. And you also mentioned that their lens of what is spooky or horror-inducing are unique. I'm curious, what do these regional films bring to the horror genre?
One of the things that film is so good at is taking you out of your perspective. And so whether that is as simple as you see someone of a different age, a different gender, a different background or whatever, but when you get supplanted into a whole different world, it's even more immersive because you have to relearn certain rules about how people are respected or not, or how you achieve something. And if you want to feel powerless, there's nothing more powerless than not knowing the world you're in. So whereas some genres really struggle to translate across borders, I would argue that horror is more effective because there's even less information you have. You're less comfortable, which is surely the point. And so there's lots of ways that if you look at things like VHS 2 and things like that, they've taken them to different places around the world. And there's also a number of entities in horror directors that are sort of, one has made a film called Satan's Slaves, which has done quite well. And so these are films that are starting to find their identity and spread out there. And I'm really fascinated to see whether the government bodies are willing to back them, because in most countries, horror is underfunded when it comes to public funding because there's not quite as proud as we made this drama about life. We made a film called Bio Zombie. Like, they don't tend to want to do that. But as it's reflecting their culture and it's coming from their filmmakers, we're going to have to see more of these public bodies stepping up and being like, yeah, we make horror films that entertain people and we're proud of it. Let's export that to the world.
That's great. So you've studied the most adapted authors in horror cinema, which I think is super interesting. How do these literary foundations shape the narratives and success of horror films today?
film comes is as a medium, I guess, is a combination of the circus and literary. In America, you had a lot more of a kind of a history of circus and Barnum and Bailey and things like that. And in Britain, it's much more of an extension of theatre and literary and stuff like that. And so that's the origins of the movie business. And so a lot of the early films were adaptations of books, because that was where that's where Gothic started, I guess. Also, I think when you have a really powerful idea from a book, Frankenstein, Dracula, it's a very flexible thing for you to be able to create a film about, because what you're creating is about the character. A long novel has way too many plot points and nuance and too much insight, because you can see into people's heads, you can jump around the world, than a film can ever do. That's why quite often books are either truncated to be movies or split into multiple movies. But when you have such a compelling idea as Frankenstein or Dracula or whatever, it's so flexible to be used in a horror comedy or a terrifying film, or to do an unusual adaptation or tell it from a different point of view, or like the Julia Roberts film Mary Raleigh, which is the Frankenstein story from a different perspective. So there's so much more you can do with it, and there have been many centuries of books, so we're able to pick from the best of books just to find the best ones for the early horror films that set the tone.
That's great. This kind of brings me back to my first questions on just like the profitability of these films. In my mind, I'm thinking about some massive winners, Young Frankenstein or Zombieland, or these things that have approached the horror genre, but then actually subverted it and had happy-ish endings or silly endings that are just purely sort of joy-inducing versus horror-inducing. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think horror, I don't know if it stands alone from other genres, but certainly it does it a lot more than other genres, which is that it's aware it's a movie. Not all films, like there are horror films that are there to try and pretend they're real. By the very nature of horror, you can't genuinely believe it's really happening. Otherwise, you're seeing people die, and that's horrific. And you've got to maintain a little bit of, that's an actress, she's probably got an agent, she's fine, there's a sequel. And so that the other end of that spectrum is the Scream, like knowing wink, like we know this is a horror film. In fact, I rewatched Scream recently, and I'd forgotten how much of a great horror film it is by itself. It's terrifying. It's really well put together, as well as completely breaking down and funny. Yeah, exactly. And it's fun to watch. And so it somehow navigates the in-out. It's a film, it's not a film. It's a film, it's not a film. And like we need that as well. I mean, 90 minutes of being terrified would be exhausting and bad for our physical health, I'm sure. And so horror manages to do that really well in a way that drama doesn't. Drama doesn't say, these two aren't really married, they're not really getting divorced, it's fine, the kids are going to be okay. You don't do that. You say in that moment. And so horror lends itself to that awareness and that comedy and that element. And I think a good filmmaker can use that as part of their paintbrush of tools of working out, when is this real? I mean, a great example is Cabin in the Woods.
Gosh, what a great, hilarious film. Yeah, wonderful.
It's a great comedy by itself. It's a great horror by itself. And it's both. And the tempo of when it is scary and when it is genuinely funny is so well paced that it's great. It just flies by. And there aren't many genres that can pull that off, I don't think.
One of the things that you're just having me reflect on, and it's such an interesting and beautiful insight, but when you think about the pacing and the beats of a great horror film that sort of knows itself, it is using all of the film craft to pull you in, to remove the idea of your belief that it's a film, and then it lets you back in, like, nope, just kidding, it is a film, and then does it again with the pacing, the music, the structure of the scene, and then nope, just kidding. And to be able to do that act over act is really amazing.
Especially because we know going into this, it's a lie. Like, we know it's not real, and yet it's the genre that pulls us in the most. And there was one thing that I studied, and I found this out before the report, but was able to go deeper into it for this report, which really blew my mind when I found it. But then when I thought about it, it made perfect sense, which is, by the way, the perfect template for any bit of discovery, something that you didn't know that you find out, and then you think about it and it adds depth to what you already knew. So I looked at the average shot length, how long between cuts in all movies and different genres. And the fastest are sci-fi, adventure, and action, where they're sort of an average about 4 seconds per shot across a whole movie. So that is, I mean, obviously there's some fast cutting in there. But horror is at the other end. Horror is about 16 seconds on average per shot, even more so than drama. And initially I thought, no, that can't be right. That must be wrong. It must be within the, because it's visually exciting. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, no, it's about controlling what you see. It's about making you not look into the box or around the corner or hang on the fact that that victim is getting closer to their doom. And it's the control of what the viewer gets. And so that made perfect sense, and it was really pleasing to discover that. But also it goes back to what you were just saying, which is so then you've got that technique, you've got that ability to control what people see and hear and understand. How do you use it? In the hands of someone who's really talented, Wes Craven or Joss Whedon or whomever else, it can just take you somewhere that you'd struggle to do with most other types of movies.
That's fantastic. So one of the things I saw in the report that I thought was interesting is that remakes saw a peak in the 2000s. I'm curious, what do you believe caused the surge, and why do you think we've seen a decline in remakes since then?
Well, a lot of these things are cyclical. The third horror film ever made was a remake. So, it is as old as the genre. There was a Haunted Castle film, which I think was made in French first, and then it was obviously just a short, but then it was remade as a English language one. And so the idea of a remake is as old as time. But yeah, you're right. We saw a peak in the 2000s of films based on previous movies. That and that was coming up to sort of 8% of horror films were based on some previous movie. But the thing is, if we think about what that is as like a remake or a reboot, one thing that has not declined since the 2000s is the idea of being a sequel or part of a series. And in fact, actually, the peak for that was the 1940s, because there were so many of these that were in the sort of X versus Y, or even, you think about Albert versus Costello, or whatever, Albert and Costello meet whoever, or this versus that. And we would now call it the Marvel Cinematic Universe model, where you have connected films, but they're not necessarily in the same thing, but they are part of a series. And so we shifted away from reboots into part of a bigger universe, and like Conjuring or whatever it would be. And as for why, I don't know all the answers, and I'm not 100% certain, but I do think it was about a time where those people from the 1980s and 1990s who grew up with horror, who weren't ashamed of horror, started to say, okay, let's really go for it. And they started to pick up old franchises and say, okay, we're going to reboot these. There was a keen audience. So then there was this, oh my God, there's all of it. In the same way that when DVD came out, the first thing they did was re-release all the old movies on DVD. And so then they had this boom of selling loads of DVDs because they remastered them or whatever. Then after that, we're getting a bit tired of that. But also, some of those reboots produced franchises that continue. And so we don't need to do as many remakes. Not only have we remade a lot of them, so there isn't as much property lying around there, but also we can continue to make a derivative, which I don't mean in a pejorative sense. I don't mean that's a bad thing. It's just by definition, they're not original screenplays. We can make more derivative films from those reboots. So I would see it as a sort of resurgence and a reseeding of the landscape, rather than because audiences hated them or anything like that.
Here's an interesting question I saw when sort of looking at the preview of the report. I'm curious, can you discuss the trend of declining horror sequels, but increasing box office revenue? What does this say about audience preferences?
It's so interesting that you've asked me that in the framing of the audience, because there's two ways of looking at it. One is the audience, and the other is in the behind the scenes. Let's say the people that green light and market movies. And I don't know which is right, because it's interplay of the two. Obviously, the people selling movies are trying to get the people buying movies to buy them. However, the people that buy them can only buy the ones that are offered. And crucially, we all know how powerful marketing is. So it's a self-sustaining loop where you need the people selling the movies, and making and selling, I'm using here loosely, to have confidence in something. And then they push it to the exclusion of everything else, and then people buy it. So yeah, we're seeing, although there's a decline in sequels, the box office is well over 50% in the last few years of the horror box office, theatrical, worldwide, that has gone to films that are sequels in some way. There's an obvious answer that people who commission films do so out of fear. Professionally, I'm not saying anything bad about them, but they've got to invest a lot of money and a lot of their own reputation in something, and they have very little upfront to know what's going to work or not. So when you have A or B, and A is a wholly original thing that you need to believe in, and B is something that worked before, and let's put a third factor in here. C is that your kids are at school and the fees are due. And this is a job for you rather than a passion, or purely a passion. You're going to take what you think of as the safer option, given that it's all not safe anyway. So I think there's a certain amount of fear in the commissioning, but I also think that audiences do want the same but different. That old adage. When I watch a movie, very rarely do I not know the emotional experience I'm going to have. A film festival will be the exception, where someone says, oh, this film, you're at Cannes and the film hasn't been seen by anyone. There's no reviews. And they're like, oh, well, go see this. And you're like, all right. But normally, and for the most experience of most people watching a movie, you have already calculated in the emotional experience you're going to have. This is going to lift you up. It's going to terrify you. It's going to be familiar. It's the 50th time you've watched The Office through, so you know the episodes, whatever it is. And in the world where we're emotionally exhausted and surprised constantly, having a bit of familiarity, I mean, that's why kids like watching the same episode of Sesame Street 20 times, because there is something familiar. And so what's the newest, most familiar thing? It's a sequel. You could watch the original, or you can watch basically the original, but with, a new spin on it. And so there is a certain amount that's what people want. I'm not sure it's the best for art, but that's another side conversation. Like it is a spiral of derivativeness, which could lead to the squeezing out of original ideas. So I'm not making the case that it's a good thing, but I can understand on both sides, the selling and buying of movies, why people I'm forgiving of them, why they make the decisions to push sequels and to pay for sequels.
That's a fascinating thing. And you mentioned a market cycle here. I mean, there could be a time where audiences feel fatigued from the same thematics or genres, and then that's an opportunity for a breakout story. And I would imagine there's times where the world is feeling fatigued by real life events and they want the familiar comfort of genres that they've known. And that actually brings me to a couple of funny questions from what I saw in your report. I believe your data shows an interesting trend in clown-based horror films. Talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't hate clowns. I'm not a very anti-clown, but I'm also not very positive clowns. I think most people aren't particularly bothered, and then some people really, really are. So I'm a bit worried about angering the clown lobby, mostly because if they turn up, it'll be terrifying. But the studies that have been done in the world show that most people, I think it was something like 60-something% of people, have some degree of fear of clowns. Like they are fundamentally not the reassuring thing they're sold as. They are unsettling. And so we start from an unsettling place. But then there's been this sort of boom. So pre-1960s, there were almost no clowns. And here I'm using clown as a proper, rather than just the sort of, this is the character who actually is a clown in some way, rather than just a big smile. And, all these things have gradations, but proper clowns. But it really was in the 2010s where we started to see so many proper clowns. And obviously we've had It come back recently. And I think horror likes to take something that feels safe and make it feel unsafe. Like that is the essence of a really good, scary story, is that you thought something was benign or you thought it was safe. And it turns out it's not. Like, it's not your parents. They've been replaced. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's one of the most terrifying things. And so clowns are inherently sold to us as joyous, but also they're utterly terrifying. And so it's not hard to make a horror film, to make sort of killer clowns from outer space. You can make that terrifying and fun. And I think that was the same. Killer Clowns from Outer Space was 1988. And there was also Clown House from 1989. So there was a few that kind of showed that actually, and obviously It in all its forms, TV and book, and then more recently, it's not that hard to make a terrifying film. I mean, and of all the subgenres that horror clowns appear in within horror films, torment and gore are the most. There's not really been many post-apocalyptic clown horror movies, but maybe there's a niche in the market. Maybe there's a gap. I don't know.
Maybe it's coming. Maybe after this episode airs, a astute filmmaker will make it happen. Another interesting thing I saw, is it true that the role of aquatic monsters is rising in horror films?
Yes. And this is one of the ones where I absolutely love, because there's no way we're going to figure this out, right? Let's say that I hadn't done the data and you and I were sitting there chatting. There's no way we're actually going to figure this out ourselves. But when we start looking at the monsters that are in monster movies, so this is within... It's like all of horror as a genre, and then you look within monster movies as a subgenre of horror. I looked at the different types of monsters, and I put them into the biggest categories were flying, aquatic, and then land-based mammals. And land-based mammals are the largest, although they're declining. And since around 2000, we started to see aquatic monsters really rise from they were about 20% of monsters to about 40, coming up to 50% if we were to project forward, who knows. It's a very clear trend, and so I believe it's true, and the graphs in the report. But I was talking with a few people about it because I equally found it fascinating. And one of my friends, who is a producer, she produces horror films. She said that she feels that it's because visual effects have improved, and land-based mammal that is a monster is a man in a suit. I hate to break it, but it's a man going rah. But an aquatic monster needs a lot of special or visual effects, right?
Let me ask you a question. This is a hot take. Is Godzilla an aquatic monster?
Godzilla is everything to everyone, because every reboot or every kind of cycle they go, there is two versions of Godzilla. Godzilla is the solution. Godzilla is the problem. And in them, we've been through this, postmodern, postmodern, where all heroes are just misunderstood, and if only we understood their childhood, we'd be fine. And then they go back to being malevolent, and that's what we've seen in all the versions of Godzilla. Godzilla definitely swims pretty damn good. I would say that he would probably, in most of the Godzilla films, come out as a land-based mammal, but there are some where he's clearly swimming. And it's in the essence of that film. What is the version that filmmaker has decided to tell, rather than there being some platonic, perfect Godzilla that we all should be tracking?
That was a tremendously political non-answer, Stephen.
Damn it, I thought I got away with it.
It is funny, though, to ask you and to shift from aquatic sea monsters to real-world events, right? So whether Godzilla is or is not an aquatic monster, there are many people that really think about Godzilla as a meditation on the horrors of World War II and the occurrences of real events in the world that are horrific. And I was really curious, in addition to like the example of Godzilla, and in relation to this description that you gave of horror going through cycles where sometimes consistent fantasy that is comfortable is popular, and then we become tired of that and we want novelty. Could you elaborate on how these themes of real world things, like, for example, infection in horror films has evolved, particularly in relation to events like the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, can you maybe thread the needle for us between sort of fantasy horror versus horror as a meditation on real world situations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to start from, every photo is a lie, every film is a lie, everything is constructed, and even documentary. But when we start making horror fiction films, we are making almost everything up. However, we are also reflecting real world. Like, everything is there as metaphor in some way. More importantly, we are connecting it to the world in which we live and thinking, and horror more than almost any other genre, you're thinking, how would I survive? Like, the best idea for a horror film is one that you can easily understand and then walk around with, even before you've seen the movie, and think about, like The Purge. What a great idea. One day a year, you can do whatever you want. Films like that really help because they allow us to do one purpose of film and entertainment which is simulation. It allows us to think, well, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why Marvel movies are so successful, is because loads of people are thinking, well, what if I become one? Like, I just need to do the research in case I really am a superhero. I mean, I don't think I am, but it'd be good to find out. It's good to be ready if I found out. And so horror does that more than most. Pandemics are fascinating because the boom in pandemic-based horror movies was actually around 2000s. So 28 Days Later really kicked off. It's not a great film, and on so many levels, it's a great film, but it's also shot on a lower budget and did really interesting things. And it's not quite Patient Zero, but it is a film which did kick off loads of other pandemic-based films. And so the boom in pandemic-based films is pre-COVID-19, which is fascinating because it means that, I don't know if you remember, at the beginning of lockdown, things like Contagion and things like that were doing fantastic. It was like the #1 film on the Apple Store and stuff like that, because people were like, they couldn't get from the news or from the politicians or from the doctors, what does this mean? Because we didn't know, but we could go through simulation. And when there were a few movies that had enough points that overlapped with what we were hearing on the news, it felt relevant. I mean, it's not relevant because, I mean, some films are going to be accurate, some are not, but it felt relevant. And there was a really fascinating film that was it was a good film, but it was also just the craziest timing. There was a film called The Pink Cloud from a Brazilian filmmaker. And she made a film, she shot it before the pandemic, and it was about this mysterious pink cloud that goes over the city, and it's in the air with an infection, so everyone basically goes into lockdown. And she made and shot this film before the pandemic, but it came out in the 2020 Sundance selection. And it's so interesting because it's only a fiction film. There are loads of fiction films. We talked about there are thousands of horror films. This film practically has no relevance any more than any other film. However, it felt so timely. It felt so relevant. It felt so important to watch that it was appreciated and went far further because of it, which is, great. Well, that's wonderful. So film has that way of being able to do that. But I mean, talking about real life events, so one of the side gigs I do is that I work for Guinness World Records, adjudicating movie records, but usually stupid movie records, ones with data or whatever. And I have recently, in fact, this might be the first airing of it. This is an exclusive new world record that's been created that you are hearing about for the first time on this podcast. And this has been accepted and will be in the book that we're writing that's going to come out in 2025 that will be called the 2026 book, which is the least realistic genre has gone to rom-com. And my explanation as to why is because it is the genre that is least based on real life events, and which is fascinating because I found it out during this doing the research for horror films. I thought horror would be the least based on real events, given what's in horror films. But no, there are lots of horror films that, now here's the crucial word, claim to be based on real life events. And so that became a really interesting conversation because you can imagine myself and lots of other people that work at Guinness are just nerds who love talking about is that actually based on a real life event? And if you say that the devil has possessed this woman in 1980 and we've made a film about it, you might be true in saying we made a film about the claims that this happened, or even that this woman existed. But given that I personally don't believe the devil existed or actually possessed someone, is it based on a real life event? I don't know. And so is The Conjuring real, or the exorcism of Emily Rose? And also people lie as well. Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre says it's based on a real life event. It's really not. It's based on a person, but it's horror sometimes. There's Fargo as well. It's just as...
Well, I was just going to say, the Coen brothers were geniuses for saying at the very beginning of the film that it was based on true events.
Utter genius, because the whole, it's so funny that we believe that they wouldn't lie to us, even though we're watching a fiction film written by people to entertain us. But yeah, so horror is not the genre with the most based on real life, but it's more than you think.
I love that. There's a classic sort of observation by magicians that people are very astute when it comes to you lying to them on its face. But if you lie twice or three times, but the underlying premise is a lie, but then you give all these other details and you let them in that it's a lie, but this one is they'll believe it. It's like holding on to the facts is very difficult for people.
I've got a friend who works in production, and I'll keep the things vague so I'm not causing a problem. But there is a very well-known magician that has done TV things, and I know this person quite well. So I said, not the magician, but the crew member, and I said, so how do they do it? Because I know that's true and that's true and that's true. And they didn't say anything. They just looked at me with these dry eyes of come on. And and through their lack of information, I picked up, oh my God, they're just lying. It's well, yes. That's exactly what I was like. I felt so, because I was like, well, we know he didn't do this. And who told you that? And I was like, oh yes, shit, sorry.
Right, of course, yes. My Homo sapien brain is subject to being easily fooled, yes. Hilarious. Okay, shifting a bit from your data, Stephen, what have you found to be the most critical factor in the profitability of horror films? So what I mean by this question is just brass tacks. If you're a filmmaker listening to this podcast, maybe you've done some films before, never horror, you're thinking about it. What do you think are just first principles thinking around best practice related to profitability in the horror film genre?
Well, I mean, I try not to stray too much into the creative realm, because I genuinely want filmmakers to make their own films. I don't want to make them from a formula. I think that would be bad for them and also bad for the world. So I'm trying not to step too much into the realm of here's a story you should tell. That said, I do think the best horrors do tend to have a premise that is easily transmitted as a sort of social contagion. It's got to be an idea that fully lives within the head of the audience. And so some of the ones that I really like, for example, Teeth or Prevenge, which are both fascinating horror films that you can absolutely walk around with it in your own head. And then you want to see how the filmmakers did it, or The Purge, as I described earlier on. So there's got to be a visceral social contagion of the idea through ideally the title, although let's be honest, it's probably going to be a sentence or two after that. This film is about X. And Blumhouse has done fantastically well to come up with films that have that, but then they put a star into it. because a star isn't going to save anything. Like, it's not just going to be good enough to have someone famous in it. This isn't a genre that will support that on its own, but it can be an accelerant to an idea. So it needs to have a thing about it that makes people go, and then it stays in their head. It can't be something that you have to feed them. And so there's that. I think also you have to make a very clear promise to the audience of as I said, the emotional experience they're going to have. So Terrifier 3 is currently doing Great Guns, and their promise is, can you survive? Can you watch this? And like, that is so powerful. It doesn't appeal to me. I'm never seeing that movie, but I get that. I might even recommend it to people. I may never see it, but it's such a powerful, clear pitch that I would be able to pitch it to friends of mine who I think might enjoy it. And so if you can go through people who are never seeing a movie and still use them as advocates, that's a powerful idea. So, I mean,
that's a great point. I mean, for me, like the Saw series had sort of that underlying premise, which is like, can you get through this? And if you can you get through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, you know?
It'll never end. And I think that's what's so good. It's a perfect franchise material as well, because it's not about this individual character that you want to see survive the way that you might for other series or whatever. This is fundamentally about the experience. It's so franchisable and also so repeatable. You enjoy. I mean, Final Destination's another great example of that, where you just can keep printing them because you are delivering them. You're not just delivering the same thing. It's not recycled. It's just a new variation of the same thing. So I would say that is, on the creative realm, a powerful idea, easily communicated, that lives in people's heads. That would be very powerful. When it comes a bit more to the production side of things, obviously it's almost asinine to say the lowest you can make it, the more money you're going to make. The lower the bar for profitability is. And horror does, more than any other genre, thrive on low budget, poor picture quality, maybe not sound. Sound is incredibly important, but poor picture quality can add to something the way it might not be able to in others. And also not quite janky effects, but the audience are much more forgiving of something visually if it's emotionally working. So you've got audience on your side, but you also do have to make sure that you are delivering a full experience. And I think there is a slight myth in the industry that you can make a film on any budget, because you physically can. You can make 90 minutes of material, but whether you can properly deliver it and get it within the professional world, whether you've got contracts, you've got completion bonds, you've got, the full chain of title and fully filled sound that can be distributed. I mean, producer friends of mine tell me sort of $1 million is sort of the level where you could probably keep making films, whereas below that, it's something else. It's a calling card. It's a showcase, at which point I would suggest making a short film, make a very, very deep but short in length version of it. I mean, Smile came from a short film and was hugely successful. So you don't need much of it, but it needs to be the full version of it.
That's fantastic. Stephen, I was wondering, did you find any correlation in the rise of the horror genre related to digital tools becoming available? Because I ask in that I've been around a lot of unscripted and reality television producers, and they directly correlate the rise of their genre to the availability of digital film tools and cameras. Did you find or do any research around that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very high correlation, but we do have to be careful about correlation not being causation, because it's happened at the same time. Now, it makes logical sense because, as I said, the horror genre thrives on a low budget, and also it appeals to audiences who are more willing to watch low budget, and also to the filmmakers. The age of filmmakers is slightly lower for horror films than the average age for other genres. And so they tend to have less resources because you've had less time to sort of get the resources in your life. So yeah, I think it is the perfect genre for low budget and explains some of that explosion. And also then you have these really iconic films, whether it's Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity, you have availability bias. You can imagine a low budget film on a new technology that is a horror film that could thrive. Whereas you don't naturally get that with sci-fi. Like, you can make a sci-fi on a handy cam 15 years ago. Of course you could, but it was things like Monsters, which was an unusual film in the sense that it was a low budget sci-fi on more sort of the Gareth Edwards film, who went on to make Godzilla. But he did it on a very low budget, a couple of actors and visual effects himself on his laptop. That is unusual for sci-fi. In horror, that's the template. The template is when I was at film school, I was told the way you make a horror film is you get 4 kids, you take them to the wood and chop them up. Like, that's all you need to do. And it's very reductive, but no one has that about other genres. You don't say that about sci-fi. All you need to do is get 4 people, put them in a spaceship.
Or very rarely, like a film like Gattaca was like probably relatively low budget, phenomenal, but like very literary driven, very like driven by like interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, lastly, Stephen, I've got to ask. So, did the data show anything related to strategies for releasing to maximize audience engagement? You talked about some of these things that are sort of happy accidents, right? Pink Cloud during a time when the culture was interested in this, but just broadly across the genre, across the research, how should filmmakers strategize?
I think it's have a very clear concept early on, maybe before the script, have a very, very clear idea. And this goes back to the creative concept. And then think in 2 years' time, when you've made it, and let's say it's the best version of that concept, how are you going to most make that live within the largest number of people? And so, as we talked about, Terrifier 3 has just come out, and they've done a terrific job in selling can you cope with this movie? And the way they did that was that they did these talker screenings with unsuspecting audiences. And it turns out, from what I can understand from the outside, they did everything honestly. I don't think they literally lied to anyone, but they did manage to get test screening audiences who knew they was going to see some sort of holiday film who didn't know it was a horror film. So having people walk out and vomit is probably exactly what happened. And apparently the theater that was running these test screenings also didn't know that there was going to be a film that was this extreme. And so what you've then got is these stories of people, 8 people walked out, 4 people threw up. And then they've got all these footage of people going, I loved it, but 3 people next to me couldn't take it. Like they knew when they were making the concept of Terrifier 3, what would sell in the future few years, year 2 from there when they finished the film. And they thought, how are we going to make that fun and viral as an idea? And they delivered it. So my sort of rhetorical question to a filmmaker who's thinking of putting a horror film together, wants to do it, as you said, as tactically as possible, is to say, what is the thing or the couple of things about your film that is just going to captivate, make people have to see your film specifically? And then how are you going to communicate that to the audience through whatever medium you use, whether it's social media, talking screenings, marketing, if there's a budget, whatever it is. And if you can't describe that before you write the script or before you commit anyone's money, you're not ready. You're just not ready. And you can do this for other genres, but it's a lot more nuanced. Like for drama, you have to think about what the trailer might be. Can you boil the story down to be a compelling question? But for horror, it's so much simpler. It's a conversation. If you are an investor and you are thinking of putting money into a horror film, you should be able to, in a couple of sentences, be able to communicate to somebody who might go and see it, what it is, and they should be excited to see it and annoyed that it's not out yet. If you can't do that, put your checkbook away because it's not ready yet.
That's awesome. Well, Stephen, this has been such a wonderful and insightful conversation. Thanks for all of the spooky insights. Can you tell our listeners, where can they find you? Where can they find the report?
Yes. Thank you for inviting me. This has been so much fun. I could do this for hours. Horrormoviereport.com. And there's a couple of versions of the report. There's a one for film fans, which is just the 400 odd pages of graphs and charts and stuff. And then there's a film professional version where you can get all the data as Excel spreadsheets. There's a couple of bonus reports on film festivals and business plans, how to write a business plan for a horror film, both at horrormoviereport.com. And if you have any questions that aren't in the report or about things other to do with horror, I'm at stephenfollows.com. And as I said, my best questions come from my audience. I would love to hear if you have a question about the industry, especially if data might give you the answer. I love this. And any interaction that I get from the audience always makes the work better. So yeah, stephenfollows.com is probably the best place outside of the horror report.
Beautiful, Stephen. Thank you for joining me on Production.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
On Production is brought to you by Wrapbook, the production industry's only on-demand payroll platform. With Wrapbook, you can pay your crew with a click and track all your costs in real time, all in one place. To find out more about how Wrapbook is transforming the way productions pay their crews, visit wrapbook.com.